Now, this is very significant with this edition of the Pentagon Papers. You said this is the Gravel edition, which is the one you feel is the best of the ones, the one that Gelb helped put out, which was the New York Times edition that was just one paperback.
Yes, there's a great distinction between that, and your point is very well made. You see, there was much, when these papers were released, the idea was that this young man, Daniel Ellsberg, had released I think over 4,000 top secret documents, and that's all they talked about, the top secret documents. You don't do that. President Nixon went right through the roof. Well, Senator Gravel could see in this some very important historical records. So he took the complete set of documents and he sat there in the Senate and for days read every single word. That's why this is called the Gravel edition. That put all of these documents into the congressional record officially. If you wanted to go back and buy a congressional record of that period and get a great big truck to haul it away, that's what so the Gravel edition is a fundament to understanding this period, because point by point, this is what the Pentagon Papers were. Now that's all that guarantees. Right. There was no way Senator Gravel could get into this thing. The fact that Senator Gravel, by the way, was born in Massachusetts. He knew who Kennedy was. He'd have put Kennedy in here as having died that day. But he was a senator from Alaska, but at least he knew what was going on. It's quite a commentary on the way history is treated. Again, like with the GSA book, this book of the Foreign Relations of the United States is about the period August to December 1963. The book is released and printed in 1991. You see, from 63 to 91, you can have, what, 4 or 5 generations of college students, right, high school students. You can have many, many, many history books written, people who can write anything they want because they don't have sources, so they just use their imagination, write anything they want. And finally, about 30 years later, you get the official record, and you know what? And I do this many times. I go to campuses to lecture, and they say, well, we hear what you say, but we read 6 books in our class, and this is the way it was. That's poison. Yeah. You know, that's poison. But it's the facts of life, because you can't get the record. They do it backwards. The government should release the record immediately. Right. It's not secret. My God, there's nothing about the Bay of Pigs that was secret 10 minutes after the guys landed. In fact, before they landed. What's secret? This here was not only, there's a special stamp on here. This paper was not only stamped top secret, it was stamped ultra sensitive, above top secret. Well, what was ultra sensitive about the Bay of Pigs after, and let's look at something else. Important people are involved in these things. You've heard the name, haven't you? Sure. General Lansdale. Now, I met General Lansdale in the Philippines in 1953. I was a commander of a military air transport squadron, and my regular duty, just like an airline, were flying from Tokyo to Manila to Saigon to Bangkok and on through to Dhahran in Arabia, through India. And on the other side, fly to Honolulu. So we had an awful lot of ground to cover. But in my going back and forth through Manila, I met Lansdale, I met Valeriano, his Filipino friend who was Magsaysay's chief of staff, and people like that. So I know Lansdale very well. Later, when Lansdale came back from the Philippines, and when I was done in Tokyo, we both happened to be assigned to the Office of Air Force Plans, and his office was just one section over from where my office was. I knew him very well during that period. Then, in early 1960, General Lansdale was assigned to the Office of the Secretary of Defense in the Office of Special Operations, which covered clandestine operations, the national security agents, the reconnaissance business, all the highly classified jobs. And within a month or so, I was transferred to the same office to do the same work in the Secretary of Defense's office that I'd been doing for the Air Force, which was the military support of the clandestine operations of CIA. So then I was responsible for a global program. But again, we were both back in the proximity of each other. So I would say I probably knew General Lansdale as well as anybody. I wouldn't make it a broad claim, but I know enough to know that when I read a biography about him, or when I read his autobiography, that strangely enough, like they did in the Pentagon Papers, and not putting Kennedy's assassination in there, there's a lot of things in here that are wrong.
Right.
Because having lived in this covert, clandestine atmosphere for so long, there are just many things he can't write, so they're not in the book. And for instance, one of them here, his biographer writes about me, because I wrote in my books what happened, and I wrote that General Lansdale was a CIA man operating under the cover of the Air Force.
Right.
And the biographer says, Prouty's all screwed up. He doesn't know that. Well, I'll just tell you a little incident about it to show you how I know, among other things, that happened. I was promoted to colonel in 1960. And when I came into the office, Lansdale came over and congratulated me. And then we sat down and we were having a cup of coffee together. And he said, you know my position. He said, I'm much older than you are. I'm much older than most Air Force colonels. I've been with the CIA all my life. How do I get a promotion? I said, you want a promotion to general? He said, well, it would be more fitting for the work I'm doing. Okay, take care of it. So I went back to my office, I wrote a note, sent it over to Allen Dulles. And I told him, I said, this man Lansdale has been a colonel long enough for Air Force service. The Air Force would be promoting him.
Right.
And since you pay his salary anyway, I'm sure the Air Force will not have any problem with it. Simple note. And Allen Dulles and I knew each other very well. He knew Lansdale very well. And about 2 weeks, 3 weeks later, I got a call from the office of General Curtis LeMay, Chief of Staff of the Air Force. I had worked with General LeMay many, many times. So I went up to the office to see what it was, and he had a sheet of paper in his hand, and he said, Prouty, this is the list of men we are promoting to Brigadier General, but there's one name on here I don't know, but they tell me you know something about him. What's the story? So he showed me the list, and here's General Lansdale's name to promote to Brigadier General by the Air Force. I said, oh, don't worry about that, General. Allen Dulles is paying his salary. He's a CIA man. This is simply a cover assignment. You're going to let him wear stars on his shoulders, Air Force uniform. He'd been in the Air Force uniform all through his career, or at least since the late 40s. And they're going to promote him to general, and the pay will come from CIA. Don't worry about it. Fine. He signed a paper and put it in his out basket. Lansdale. So I went downstairs and I said, Ed, you're a general. He said, how do you know? I said, you wait. You'll get a call. You're a general. Well, was he CIA or was he Air Force? Now, do you want me to understand and believe his biographer or the facts of life as both Lansdale and I led them? And this leads me to an extremely key point in the Kennedy assassination, because you see, the fact that when I look at his biography and see that it isn't correct, I can see other things that come through that involve Lansdale that are not understood. And some of them are rather fundamental, some are quite important. Not long after the Warren Commission had come out, a friend of mine showed me a group of photographs that had been taken within the period of 30 minutes before the time the president was killed and 30 minutes afterwards, thinking that people who were involved are bound to be or may be within that group. And among them were pictures which have become quite famous among the assassination buff crowd, that people are studying this thing seriously. And that group is called the Tramps. I think there's 7 or 8 pictures. There may be more. I think I have about 8 of them. So here it was, what, late 64 when the Warren Commission came out, about that time.
Fall 64.
And I was shown this photograph among others. And it is chronologically the first picture of the Tramps. The police, the men here, the 2 police, were leading these 4 men.
3 men. One of them sort of obscured and then...
Excuse me, I'm counting on one there that's extra. 3 men. We're leading them from the freight car where they had removed them from the freight car, and we're taking them to the Dallas Sheriff's Office to register them. And as they were walking from the area of the
stockyards,
yard,
right,
they began to come by the school book depository building where allegedly Oswald had fired the shots. So they were just coming by the corner of the building, and this is the garage door fence material that's there.
Right.
Well, I didn't see that picture for more than about 30 seconds. Then I realized that something very strange is in this picture. Here's a policeman. Here are 2 tramps, one of them sort of behind the other so you don't see it clearly, but you can, if you look at the feet, you can see there are 4 feet down there. Here's another tramp, and here's another policeman. And here's a bystander casually walking by this strange little scene of 2 policemen with shotguns and 3 prisoners, presumably. The policemen hadn't bothered to put handcuffs on them. If they thought they shot the president, the least they could do was put some handcuffs on them, but they hadn't bothered to do that. And here's this stranger going by, doesn't even look at him, just wandering down the street as though that was going to get a cup of coffee somewhere, and this happened every day. That, I realized immediately, is Ed Lansdale. Now, I don't know why he was there. I was in Antarctica myself. I don't have any idea what he was doing the next, but I did know that at the end of October, he had resigned from the Air Force, so he was not on duty, and he had told his friends that he was going to visit someone, I think his son, in Phoenix, Arizona. And so during this same period in November, he was on his way to Arizona driving. And we found later, through the facilities of the movie group, Oliver Stone, and from the records, Lansdale's records that are at Stanford University, in a box of just random things, there is a hotel bill that was paid by Lansdale in the Fort Worth Hotel in Fort Worth, Texas, within the week when Kennedy stayed and Johnson stayed in the same hotel on their way to Dallas on November 22nd. Now, why Lansdale happened to be in the hotel at that same time, we have been unable to get further records from the hotel. It has changed hands several times since then, and they're not there. But I have no question about the identity. And to confirm my own feelings, I have gone to the trouble of writing a letter to some people who know Lansdale as well as I do. And the way I put it was, this is an interesting picture of the police and the tramps. And we've been trying to identify the tramps. Could it be that in your CIA activities you ever saw these tramps, or even the police? They appear to be in costumes instead of real police. You know, I avoided mentioning anything about the guy going the other direction. I just said, can you identify anybody in this picture? Every answer said immediately, didn't you notice that that's Lansdale in a picture? See? So it begins to open a door to an area of information about the assassination of Kennedy that a lot of people haven't thought about, haven't known about. But he was an expert at things that are more important than shooting in a thing like the assassination. Any conspiracy of that order must have a cover story that lasts year after year and is impregnable. Because if you're going to kill the president, you're going to be in power. Nobody can prosecute you. Nobody ever walked up to any of these people, even though they're in the pictures and everything else, and prosecute any of them, because the people that killed the president control the authority of prosecution. So as you study what happened, someone had to orchestrate the cover story. The Lee Harvey Oswald cover story, the Ruby cover story, and the New Orleans side of it. All that sort of stuff that the people have studied so meticulously since then has all been orchestrated just like somebody writing a movie or a play, just like Shakespeare working and putting all the characters and then making it live for 30 years. that cover story. There isn't a newspaper in this country that will print the simple sentence, Oswald did not do it. Not one. But 90% of Americans believe he didn't do it. At least not alone. He was in with a group. Lyndon Johnson told Leo Janos when he wrote for the Atlantic Monthly magazine in July of 1973.
Right.
Whoops.
That's all right. We can pick that up.
Yeah. Hello.
Hello, good afternoon. I'd like to speak to Colonel Prouty.
Speaking.
Colonel, my name is Flores. I'm calling from New York State.
Going pretty good, huh? Listen, verification of the identity of Lansdale from so many people in this photograph. What is your sense of what he was doing there?
I think it's pretty clear that his role, because he was so good at this, was the person who orchestrated the cover story. Now, many people don't think about how conspiracies work. It's not natural to us. It's simple to shoot somebody, especially with experts, and this government has trained experts. But to create a story that travels through the years and includes people like Oswald, Ruby, the New Orleans scene, all the rest of it, all these things that people have found out, everything that's in the Warren Commission report that of course is false, is a cover story. And somebody has to write that script, and somebody has to set up those individuals, and also give them the assurance that, look, fellows, we're on the winning side. No one's ever going to pick you up. The police ever pick you up, it'll be because I told them to, because you broke the rules. But don't break the rules, you're not going to be in any trouble. You know, it's a tough game,
right.
But he does it. Well, I don't know anybody that was better at that kind of script writing than Lansdale. He had the experience from the Philippines. He had the experience from many other things. He was an expert at that. And I fully believe that the cover story and that part of the scene was a function of Lansdale and his associates, the other people working with him. And as you look through the way this thing happened, you have to respect the fact that there were a lot of people who knew before Kennedy was shot that this event was going to happen. Mm-hmm. For instance, I myself was sent to Antarctica, a rather strange thing to have happen to me when I'd been 9 years in the Pentagon working on the same job, and all of a sudden one of my superiors decides I have to go to Antarctica as on military orders. Of course, it even started in a more inferential way, is the person who told me about it first was Lansdale. I met him in the hall one day, and he said, Prouty, come on in, we'll talk about something for a minute. Went in his office, and he said, I've been talking with the people who are running the next operation to Antarctica, and they would like to have you go to Antarctica. Well, I knew what he was doing. He being a general, I'm listening to my superior officer, and he already told me that he had discussed it with the people in the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He was working with Secretary of Defense at the time. And the next step was for me to go to the Antarctica office over at the White House. I went there. My name was on the records. I was on the list. I was on orders to go to Antarctica at this period of time, which didn't mean anything special to me. I've made trips all over the world anyway in this job I was in. So that's where I was when I was on my way back from Antarctica, and I was in New Zealand at the time I heard about the president being shot. I was with a congressman. We were having breakfast. It was 7:30 in the morning. We were having breakfast in New Zealand, and it was the 23rd of November in New Zealand, of course, right. On the other side of the date line, and it was 12:30 when Kennedy was shot. I think there would be about an hour slippage in time, because the time between when he was shot, when they were getting it around the world, right. There was a little slippage there, but even so, it was close enough so that I think we were hearing it about. But having heard it at breakfast time as just a little flash on the PA system in the hotel, we didn't hear anything else. We had no other news. So I went outside looking around, and finally out on the street I found a newspaper. And this newspaper clearly tells the story. But I remember looking at it quickly and turning to the congressman, and I said, look, see this building where it is alleged that the killer fired from? See, the windows are open. Some of these windows are open. when you protect the president, when you're working on protection of the president, whether you're a military man on the job or a Secret Service man, you're supposed to send people there the day before, 3 days before, hours before, whatever, but to see that the windows are down. And then, you know the timing of the motorcade. You know when they're going to be at Dealey Plaza. You have a man out in the open who just does what we're doing in the picture, looks up at the building. If a window's up, he gets on his radio instantly. There are gunmen on the roof across the street. There are people in the building. So, hey, go and get that window down. Most of the time it's innocent. Some secretary raises a window. She wants to see what's going on.
Right.
But you control the building. That was not done. And it's clear in the photograph. So I had a little bit of doubt when I first saw the paper that things were being done different. I had worked in this kind of work. I had gone to Mexico City, well, when President Eisenhower was president, working on his protection in Mexico City with all the millions of people around. We had to be very careful what street we took him down and how we covered the streets. So I'm familiar with the work. I don't do the work. It wasn't my job. I'm familiar with it. I've been sent on such jobs. Another thing I noticed that I haven't read in later information was that reporters, right on the spot, had sent out in worldwide news this information. And this is in bold type in the paper. 3 bursts of gunfire, apparently from automatic weapons, were heard. Secret Service men immediately unslung their automatic weapons and pistols. Now that's printed in this newspaper under the worldwide press, NZPA and AAP, Associated Press, and around the world. Furthermore, if by any chance you happen to be listening to CBS that afternoon about the president's visit to Dallas, CBS interrupted their programs and read the same thing. 3 bursts of automatic weapon fire. Now, have you ever heard anybody, including the Warren Commission, say that there were 3 bursts of automatic weapon fire? Have you ever seen a picture of what went on in Dallas at that time with the Secret Service men unslinging their automatic weapons and their pistols? They didn't make a move. The only Secret Service there were the ones on the car, behind the president's car. And if you remember the famous pictures of that, they didn't even move. They were hanging on the car. So where did that news come from? Or, since this probably came from a reporter standing on the ground who was simply reporting what he saw, it is probably the truth. And what we've been hearing later is not the truth. We have a choice. But it's printed here. It was broadcast by CBS. It must have happened. Why don't we know about that? That's part, again, of the cover story game, and becomes so evident when you go back to something like this with nothing but a source document. But as we look down further on this paper in the lower left-hand corner, and this is really an important part of this whole business, the same paper, lower left-hand corner of the front page, I'll read it to you. It says, the arrested man, not the killer, right, and not even the alleged killer, the arrested man lived in Russia. And from there on out, down through this page and back into interior pages is a whole story of Lee Harvey Oswald. Now, by the time this paper was printed, the police had not charged Oswald with the crime, which means that no reporter would have had a basis for researching files from all over the world, collating files and putting it all together, including a picture of Oswald in a business suit. And if you remember the pictures of him taken after he was arrested in the theater, he had on a T-shirt, I think, or a polo shirt, you know. Right. That's all he had. But here he is in a business suit with... Now, where did all that stuff get put together and prepared into a story that you could read on and on to the back pages about Oswald when he hadn't even been charged with the murder? He'd been charged. He was picked up on suspicion of the murder of the policeman, right, Tippit, but not the president. So we go back again to this photograph and my friend. You see, somebody has to write the script first. And this Oswald script was already written. Oswald was already, what he said in his own terms, the patsy. You see how it fits together? And then you get the whole scene.
Now, Lansdale worked in the government. He was connected with covert operations. The only other question initially that of course occurs is, well, gosh, he must have not liked Kennedy, or he must have been with people who didn't like what Kennedy was continuing to try to affect or do, because he was working with people to take out this president by totally illegal means, and he's in effect connected with members of government groups. Did you ever have any sense of him personally, of his own personal feelings about that you could say plausibly, yeah, he was connected with the conspirators?
Well, there's two things. Your question is very basic, and there's two things that refers to. First of all, there were times when he was very upset by Kennedy. Just after Kennedy's election, Lansdale left the Pentagon on a quick trip to Saigon to see his close friend, Diem.
Who he had helped make be the father of his country.
Yes, in fact, I'm glad you bring in that, because before he left, he came to me and he said, I'm going to Saigon, I'm going to see Diem. Would you run downtown and buy me some souvenir to give to President Diem? Get me something, some big gaudy thing to put on his desk. So I went down and I found a huge, it looked to me like mahogany base with a place for a clock and your fountain pen and a calendar all built into it, really great, and some big emblem in the middle of it. I took it back and showed it to Lansdale. He said, it's great, but on this, like a shield that was brass, he said, I want you to carve on, have somebody engrave on there, the father of his country, No Din Diem. So I took it back and they did it. He carried it to Saigon and gave it to Diem, and I've always remembered it because it cost me $780. It took me a long time to get that back, but I got it back. But that was his trip as he went out there. See, when he came back, it was January of '61, and Kennedy had been elected, and Kennedy was going to be inaugurated, and I think it was pre-inauguration, but it might have been just afterwards. Either way, he left our office one day for an invitation to the White House. And he briefed President Kennedy about his trip to Vietnam. And it was the first close-in, up-to-date briefing Kennedy had after he'd been elected. And with all the things he'd been through in the year ahead with his run for the primaries and everything else, it got him up to date on Vietnam. And as Lansdale went out of the room, Kennedy turned to some of his advisors and said, you know, that man would make a good ambassador to Saigon. And Lansdale heard that. And he came back to our offices, and one or two of us were together when he walked in, and after telling us about how successful his meeting with Kennedy was and how highly he regarded Kennedy, he said, and I may be packing to go to Saigon. And that was his ambition to go back as ambassador. He thought that would be the peak event in his life. Well, it would be. As the months went on, up to about April, after the Bay of Pigs, and Kennedy began to sour on the agency, and probably in the interim found out that Lansdale was a CIA man, not a military man, which would change his whole view of him, you see. Kennedy, without saying anything to Lansdale, appointed another man to be ambassador to Saigon. Well, I know personally from my morning coffee with him and from other things that it hurt him very badly.
Yeah.
So sure, he had a reason. But I'd like to emphasize something else that I think a lot of people just don't think about. When you're thinking about the CIA, an important letter in the CIA is the word A. It's an agency. And an agency, like a lawyer, works for its patron, works for somebody. And furthermore, Lansdale, in many respects, was the epitome of a CIA agent. And they all tell you, you're an agent, which means he's on orders from somebody. From his family background and other things during his lifetime, he was close to people in big business. When he went to Manila, he was not against Quirino, but he had been told to overthrow Quirino lawfully and get somebody else in as president of the Philippines. It wasn't because he didn't like Quirino, it was just his job. He was an agent, and he did it very successfully. It was very successful, quiet and effective, and he got Magsaysay elected legally. The votes were there to count, and Quirino was out. That was a job. So if he had this job of working up the cover story, not killing the president, working up the cover story, which of course is hand in glove, it's, I think, in the role of agent. He was a perfectionist. No one else could have done it as well. And I think that that should be respected. That's why when I write about him, it's always been a plus. I have never accused him of the idea to kill the president. I think he was given a job to do. I've known other agents who were given equally difficult jobs and carry them out. It's their business. So I think we have to be very careful about the understanding of events like this, even though we are thoroughly opposed to it. I mean, if I'd have known somebody had given him the job, I'd have tried like mad to talk him out of it. But that's another story. But you see, that's what I think his role was.
Why do you think he then, what purpose would actually be served by him being in Dallas if it was more the thing of scripting the cover story that would be floated out internationally?
Oh, it's just like when you're making a movie. The director is right up front, and when the actor or actress do something great and they just step off the film at a moment, they pat him on the shoulder, doing fine. If you notice, if you notice in this picture, these men have a little smirk on their face. And I mean, my God, if you had just shot the president, you know, and had been picked up by police, you wouldn't kind of smile at some little thing. I think that as just the fact that he walked by and they knew who he was, they thought, this is assurance. We're doing our job right. Don't worry about things. And to carry that forward, as you go through, I have 8 of these pictures of the chronology of their walk across Dealey Plaza. The last one ends on the steps of the sheriff's office. Policemen never go to the sheriff's office. These weren't policemen, they're actors. Their uniforms are different. They have some sort of a hearing aid in their ear, so on. But anyways, all a scene. When they went into the sheriff's office where the newspaper reporters were told that they were booked, there's no evidence at all that they were ever booked, and they were never seen again. So you see, they have the right to smile. Lansdale gave them assurances, everything's all right. And I think he may have circulated among the people who were there, and if the more you look in the pictures at that time, the more you begin to recognize people that were there. It was just to make sure that they all knew things were going all right. They had no way to lose. They won. Kennedy, they had taken over the government. I mean, their bosses had, not them. That's another thing. We have to completely distinguish between the people who carried out the same with actors in a movie. An actor in a movie can shoot a guy on a stage, but outside, the guy that he shot and he would have dinner together. You know, you have to treat it that way. Unfortunately, but that's the way things are done. I've been close enough to this business of clandestine operations all over the world. I have been to a place where the killers are trained, where they live. It's like a resort, and they're trained, and they have multiple identities. They could say, I was born in Argentina, I went to kindergarten at this school, my teacher was so-and-so, I went to college, I took these courses. They know their life, they carry that passport. Or they can say, I was born in Finland, I this. They know that for whichever job they're on. They're given the finest weapons in the world, they're giving the best backing, as you see here, to do the job. They do the job and say, now the other side of it, why hasn't some one of those men told the story because he was in it? Back in that little resort where he lives in a foreign country is a wife and children, and the day he goes out of line, they don't stop his pay. The family's gone. It's a tough game. I've been there. Not many writers of these history books can say that.
So perhaps he was also seeing exactly how things for himself firsthand, being there, really did transpire to possibly make the call to say, okay, release that story now out of London, or whatever, that would have been, he would know personally that things had gone whatever way they'd actually transpired, so that on the scene or immediately within the hour or something, he could make certain calls, or whatever.
Well, everything is already canned.
Right.
See, everything is ready to go.
Right.
So the minute it happens, the people he had set up to let it go, and they couldn't anticipate everything.
Right.
It took a while to get Oswald from the theater down to the police station, and they had to go through the formalities of a real police questioning. And then again, although the story hangs together pretty well, once the president was dead and the government had been taken over by these other people, they didn't worry about if it made a few mistakes. They don't. I mean, I don't think that the people who actually were on the Warren Commission have ever worried much about having to prove something that was in there.
Right.
They knew that no one would ever touch them for what they were discouraged. I know that Senator Russell, very sorry for his role in the Warren, and Hale Boggs, the member of Congress, who died under strange circumstances, regretted terribly. The two of them, I think, didn't want to sign the Warren. And there's a famous story interview with Lyndon Johnson, where Lyndon Johnson said he could not get Earl Warren to accept the job. And he finally said that was the most difficult job of convincing a man I have ever had. And anybody who knows Lyndon Johnson knows what he means. He beat the hell out of him and got him to chair the commission. So it's not an easy job for anybody in these things.
Right.
But the one thing they know is if they toe the line, they will never be prosecuted.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you can rob a lot of banks if you know they're never going to prosecute
Yep.
you.
Yep.
In fact, I've been, as a banker myself, I've always been told that the most effective way to rob a bank is with a fountain pen, not a gun. Well, that's what these guys are doing.
One last thing with the Pentagon Papers that I'd like to touch upon here, of the cover story, the way it is presented to the public in a similar way as all of this information just amazingly appearing immediately before Oswald is actually accused of killing the president at midnight that night, is the name, the Pentagon Papers. You, in your unique position, could determine a lot of these papers didn't come from the Pentagon.
Oh. As part of what they were trying to do in rewriting history, they had to make it seem as though these were bedrock papers. These were our daily business. You know, this is what was going on. In fact, one of the best things you can do is try to compare these things with this. Comes out 30, but they didn't want to wait 30 years.
Right.
And so in here you will find almost no papers signed by generals. In other words, every paper in the Pentagon, once it's been worked out and approved, is signed by some general. That's what the generals are doing there. I mean, I'm a colonel. I don't sign the paper. I bring it to the general. Well, all through here, you rarely find a paper signed by some general, unless maybe it's like General Maxwell Taylor, who's the chairman, Joint Chiefs of Staff, or a general like Lansdale. There's Lansdale papers in here. He's not really a general, see? And then where you make the distinction. Another thing they said was that in the introduction to this, they say one of the unfortunate circumstances was that they were not able to get papers from the State Department, from the White House, etc. Well, they were working in ISA. When we worked in the Pentagon, if we wanted State Department papers or White House papers, ISA, International Security Affairs, was the repository for State Department and White House papers. We were the depository for CIA papers. I had 17 files of CIA papers. I knew where they were. But State Department and the White House were in ISA.
Inside the Pentagon.
Inside the Pentagon. It's just down the hall from where my office was. And so the papers that are in here, why, my goodness, I'd say a third of them are state papers, White House papers, or related to that. So their own statement about where the papers came from is wrong. The whole Pentagon Papers was a pretense to have us believe that the Vietnam War went the way this thing says it went. And it would take days to explain all that. But when you think how few Americans realize that on the September 2nd, 1945, when Ho Chi Minh read the Declaration of Independence of Vietnam,
State of Vietnam.
that standing right beside him was Major General Gallagher of the U.S. Army, and on the other side was Lou Conine of the OSS, who had come down from China with him to put him in power in Vietnam. You begin to see that our relationship with Vietnam and Indochina began a long time before the American public understands it. Well, that stuff's not in the Pentagon Papers, you see.
And then finally, the thing with Leslie Gelb and Ellsberg, who is the presenter of these to the public. And Gelb doesn't go to the New York Times until later, or is he already at the Times at that point?
I believe later.
Okay.
Yes, I believe. You can go trace the record through these
Directories,
books, which of course are proof. I mean, the guy's sitting in the Pentagon, he's in the Pentagon. But another thing that's very interesting is that Ellsberg had considerable experience in Vietnam himself. In fact, worked with Lansdale. So the circle stays pretty tight through that whole period. And you see, they had orchestrated the Vietnam War up till the time Kennedy was going to change things.
Right.
So it's the same group that were seeing their plans for Vietnam being changed by Kennedy, who in other ways are either changing the Kennedy history on purpose with the Pentagon Papers, or ending his life, as Lansdale participated in that role, and same group of people. If you, as I told you, if you take nothing but the Pentagon records of where they sat, the telephone numbers, if they got a telephone, they're in that office, and it says so, there's no question about it. They put the telephone number and they put the room number together. And if you begin to see who these people were working all together at this same period of time, it doesn't take too much to realize that there's quite a story in the continuity of the actions, even up to Iran-Contra. Richard Secord was in ISA at the same time. Well, Secord used to be in my program when he was a major, a young man, when my program was working in Thailand. And he worked under a man, General Adderholt. And Adderholt, when he was a lieutenant colonel, was working for me. So we were doing CIA support work. And as a result, in fact, if I remember Iran-Contra, Secord and North used to call their group the Secret Team. Well, if you'll recall, the Secret Team is the name of my book that I wrote at the same time. I wrote the book in 71, 72, and they just lifted the name of the book for their operations in Iran-Contra. But this is what makes it so difficult for instance, prosecutors to find out what's going on, because they just cannot believe the intricacies of how these things are done. And that when you can see that Richard Secord worked in the same place where Ellsberg worked, in the same place where Gelb worked, in the same place where Eagleburger worked, and not always at exactly the same time, but in the same year. These books are contiguous. They follow chronologically connected. You begin to see why the things that that group of people were doing are the ones that have been made the headlines, ever since 1945, what we call the Cold War. See, they're the motor, they're the people that kept the Cold War going. General LeMay could have his bombers, and Admiral Burke could have his destroyers, somebody else could have all the aircraft carriers. They didn't do anything. Even the nuclear weapons didn't do anything. The people that did things are this little cream of the crop in the middle, the covert warriors. And it's Landsberg is the man who wrote the doctrine for special forces that was accepted into the Army at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, and what is called the Kennedy Center was opened in November of '60, before Kennedy was president, but they put his name on it because they didn't want to. They wanted to make it appear that he was the one that fostered the special force. But Lansdale and myself and a major then named Sam Wilson, we wrote the Special Forces doctrine that was taught at Fort Bragg all through the Vietnam War. Well, that wasn't Kennedy's work, you see. But again, it's the same ring of people. I flew the airplane to Fort, oh goodness, Georgia, where we picked up the curriculum from the Civil Affairs Military Government School and came back and we adapted that for the Special Forces. Because most people don't realize Special Forces originated as what we call post-strike forces.
Okay.
After the Soviet Union had been hit by nuclear weapons, the country would be devastated and they would need somebody to go in immediately and begin to take it over. And that's the job of civil affairs and military government, as we did in World War II. Well, that was going to be the job of Special Forces. And since Special Forces was not being used, we didn't have any nuclear weapons going to the Soviet Union, we began to use them in Vietnam. And the adaptation of that force to that different work came from the CIA, contrary to the desires of many people in the military, and got us deeply involved in Vietnam. So the CIA looked upon Vietnam as its war, not the military's war. It's interesting to go back to where these things start and then put them together, and you find the same people doing the work.
Just as an aside, in the present day, I note that a lot of people concerned about Iran-Contra, the war against Hussein, all this kind of orchestration present last 12 years in the Middle East. Ellsberg is these days looked at very highly by people in what would call themselves the peace movement or whatever. He's involved in something called the Manhattan Project 2, that they're trying to actually deal with really taking weapons offline permanently or whatever. And another player in the late 60s, key in the movie and in Garrison's struggles with the government, was Ramsey Clark, who these days is treated as a very strong advocate of this whole war crimes in the Middle East that the U.S. has perpetrated and stuff. He's just looking like a real peace warrior. But at the time in the late 60s, in 67, he was instrumental in blackballing Garrison, in having the government pronounced a tax on Garrison from Washington, as the movie, Stone's movie at times, has somebody standing in as if he's Clark giving these pronouncements as Attorney General at that time under Johnson. I never can quite figure out these people who appear to be so chameleon-like. They seem so honorable, so they're motivated by the best of intentions. But if you look at their records that nobody these days is calling them on, of these other things, of either releasing a cover story of what the Vietnam War was all about to the New York Times, or of being the Attorney General leading law enforcement officer of the land, but at the same time savaging the one man in the country who was the only person who ever tried to mount a criminal prosecution of people for the murder of the President of the United States. That kind of disconnect of history again, it seems.
Well, you see, that's indicative of the period. There really is, it's a low order of honor, you might say. Right. They don't seem able, and for instance, they don't recognize the role of the military through this. Notice how silent these senior military officers have been about Vietnam and even about the Kennedy assassination, because they were advising Kennedy every day, every chance they had. My boss, Lemnitzer, that I had to go to every time there was any paper that in my field of business, I'd have to go to see General Lemnitzer. And when I'd meet with Lemnitzer, it was invariably with the Marine Commandant, Shoup, a splendid man who was very close to Lemnitzer. And then when it was a full meeting, there would be Arleigh Burke there. And at the time, the Chief of the Army, I'm sorry, I can't remember the name, but usually it would be Shoup and Lemnitzer. And we discussed these things. And I could tell how carefully he watched any briefing that I had to bring to him about what the CIA was doing in Vietnam, because he did not want at all to get U.S. troops engaged. I have gone to Kurt LeMay, you know, the old bomber pilot, with a sheaf of what we call target papers. And I've showed him the target papers and said the CIA wants that area bombed as soon as possible. And without going into details, LeMay would say no. Can you imagine LeMay say no to some bombing? I mean, these are the things that actually happen,
right,
compared to the things that we read about. Now, he had his reasons for doing that. Our bombers in those days were designed for nuclear weapons, and they wanted it bombed what we call iron bombs. So there's a difference in all that sort of thing. But the answer was no. He could have had the plane modified and so on. There was an enormous difference between the military people in that era and the agency's cold warriors, you see. And that's what this was all about in the investigation of the Bay of Pigs, when these senior men, including Walter Beetle Smith, were getting the word to the president, look, that was a failure, here's why it happened, now let's don't do that anymore, we won't have that anymore. Like Smith said, throw the slop out and get rid of it, you know. We haven't listened to that side of the story at all. It doesn't appear in the Pentagon Papers, it doesn't appear in this, in the government, the other papers. And that's really the essence of this whole thing, because President Clinton wants to bomb Bosnia,
right,
and he bombs Somalia, he bombs any, you know, wants to go in with bombers. And what are we going to do if the people in Bosnia acquire ground-to-air rockets? They can knock our planes down, just bing, 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 bing. Then what are we going to do? Invade with 200,000 troops? See, the steps are automatic afterwards. And there have to be people who can talk to people like presidents and congressmen and all and say, look, this is what can be done. Because if you go a step too far, it's like when my friend Krulak was sent to talk to Averell Harriman about certain activities in North Vietnam during the Vietnam War. Harriman said to Krulak, what do you want, a nuclear war? No, because he knew that if we got so close to Hanoi that we were going to topple Hanoi and win, we wouldn't win. We'd be in a nuclear war. And he said no. General Krulak wrote a book called First to Fight, about Marines. And that marvelous little book has a chapter about Vietnam that every single American ought to read, because here the military had worked up a plan to win the war in Vietnam.
What year was that?
Oh, that was in '64,
okay,
maybe '65, but it included Lyndon Johnson and Harriman and General Greene, who was coming out, so it had to be '64.
Right.
And Harriman, not McNamara, but Harriman, a civilian, said no. So there are times when people in the proper position and with the proper intelligence understand that things ought not to be done, must not be done. And we need some of them in Washington today, because we're going to have serious problems, because the most important word in a bureaucracy is simple. It's N-O. And if somebody like Eisenhower's best moves were when he said no to somebody, and he could say it quite often.
Right.
It's a good point you make about these people working back and forth, but that's also a sign of the fact that the leadership is weak. Otherwise, they wouldn't waver, even Ramsey Clark.
Well, and perhaps they're weak in some ways, too, because they're not informed.
Well,
they don't know.
Sure, you study, go to college and read these 5 volumes from one cover to the other, and what have you learned? Trash. That's a shame.
You still don't know how to interpret the documents as you knew from a lot of them being in your office or briefing the people.
Yeah. Of course, you hear a lot about that these days, and you know, we can get philosophical about it. You're never going to read the other side of the story in the current media, and you're never going to see it on TV. Where do people learn today? And the books they're reading in college aren't doing it for them. So where do you learn today? You see, this is a serious problem. It's almost like saying there's no bread in the store. Where do you get a loaf of bread? And you know, we aren't that far from that situation.
Well, I'd like to take a break, but this is a good start.
Well, it's nice of you to do all this. I don't know what it's worth, but the trouble you have with a lot of these things.
It's funny because it's the history. It's the history you just talked about not getting in the schools. Will now get in the schools.
Well, some of this can at least on some level, but you're saying on the other hand, how much of a dent can you really make in all of this mishistory that's already happened?